Hey there. Thank you so much for being a part today and for joining me. I pray that as we spend these next few minutes together, that the Lord would use our time to speak to our hearts. And I pray that we'd be open to hear what the Spirit would have to say to us. The summer between my junior and senior year of college, I took a job as a I did a lot. I was a lifeguard, was a referee. I worked in the snack shop at this camp. It was an FFA camp at White Lake, North Carolina. And so it was in a town called Fayetteville, but it was on a lake called White Lake. And FFA camp is Future Farmers of America. Now, I'm not much of a farmer. It wasn't even a part of the organization FFA when I was in high school. However, this was a complete sports camp. And so Monday through Friday, you would go, you'd check in on Monday, you'd stay at this camp on the lake for a week and just play sports all day, all night. It was so fun. It was just a lot of fun. And it was for high school kids. So it was freshmen through, seniors who just graduated. So that was my summer. About the third week into that experience, that Monday was when the campers were checking in on week 3. And there was a meeting at the very beginning. It was a counselor meeting with all the chaperones and our camp director. And so I, along with another friend of mine, Meredith, that I'd met working there for the summer, we were on kind of patrol while the counselors and chaperones were meeting with our camp director. And so we walked in, introduced ourselves, and then we immediately left so that we could go kind of patrol the area. Now, a little bit of backstory on the lake is that it's not like a typical lake because it wasn't very deep. Like, I think the deepest part was about 15 feet out in the center, and that was not even adjacent to where our property was located for the camp. So about the deepest it was in our area was about 5 feet. So it was just 5 feet deep. So really kind of neck deep for most of these kids, just a little bit over, they could stand up in the water. And we had a U-shaped pier or dock that you could walk around completely, and they would swim inside that area. But it was almost like swimming in a kiddie pool. It was very shallow water. And so Meredith and I were on patrol, and as we were walking out that Monday, I noticed that a girl was running on the pier, and you weren't allowed to do that. So I blew my whistle, yelled at her, stop running. To my surprise, she yelled back, "Somebody's drowning." And so, of course, I immediately sprang into action of like, oh my gosh, what's happening? Ran out to the edge of the pier or that U-shaped deck area and saw a group of kids carrying a body above the water back towards the pier quickly. And so I ran, got into the water, and noticed immediately that the boy, his body seemed lifeless. He was unconscious. His lips were blue and his skin was already pale, had lost its color, and his eyes were open and fixed. And so brought him to the side, and we were trained in CPR and first aid, so I immediately started CPR. And then within a matter of moments later, a couple of other people had joined us to do 2-person CPR, the camp director and another one of the counselors. Well, that was a Monday. The boy, his name was Dustin. He was 15 years old. He was life flighted to Duke University or Medical Center in North Carolina. And that Wednesday, he passed away. And ever since that experience, and it was a traumatic experience for all of us who were involved, but ever since that experience, I've been afraid for other people around water. I've felt okay for myself because I felt like I'm a competent swimmer. But anytime I see other people, especially kids, around water, I'm nervous, like really fearful. And so I find that I have trouble relaxing. And this was long before I had kids, but when I'm around kids and water, I would what you describe as a hover mother. I kind of hover. I don't let them do their thing. I just kind of hover. And some of you may secretly be applauding this and thinking, well, you're just being a good mom. But the reality is that I'm safety obsessed when it comes to the water. And I'm willing to bet that I'm not alone. As a mom of 4 boys and being around a lot of other moms, I've learned that safety is king, especially in our American culture. The phrases stay safe, be careful have become common vernacular even pre-2020. In fact, I'd be willing to venture that safety is valued over bravery. I read an interesting excerpt from a book called The Coddling of the American Mind: how good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure. And this was a review of the book, and I wanted to share this with you. It says this: members of iGen, iGen stands for Internet Generation, members of iGen, according to the psychologist Jean Twenge, who coined the term, are obsessed with safety, which they define to include expansive notions of emotional safety. They began arriving on college campuses in 2013. Rates of anxiety and depression soon skyrocketed, along with demands for trigger warnings, safe spaces, and disinvitations to controversial speakers, as well as sometimes violent confrontations with such speakers when they did appear on campus. Lukianoff and Haidt, who are the authors, offer a variety of compelling explanations for the rise of safetyism culture that so dominates elite colleges and increasingly much journalistic discourse along the lines of the nation's editorial note. One of the most intriguing ideas they present is the Australian psychologist Nick Haslam's notion of concept creep. Haslam found that since the 1980s, the key concepts in clinical and social psychology, including abuse, bullying, trauma, and prejudice, have expanded both downward and outward to apply to less severe circumstances and to take in novel phenomena. By the early 2000s, Lukianoff and Haidt write, the concept of trauma within parts of the therapeutic community had crept down so far that it included anything experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful. And you guys, this is not just true. This is not just true in our secular culture. These are not Christian people not looking at this from a Christian biblical worldview, biblical standpoint. But in our Christian culture, I see it becoming more prevalent. In fact, I would say that safety may be becoming the center of most of our prayers. I read another interesting article by John Piper called Risk Your Kids for the Kingdom, and it was a question mark, risk your kids for the kingdom. And I wanted to share an excerpt of that with you. It says this: one of the great ironies of history is that sometimes non-Christians see more clearly than Christians that the aims of family life are greater than safety. John Adams, who would become the second president of the United States, was sent as a commissioner to France in 1778. His 10-year-old son, John Quincy, who would become the sixth president later, went with him. Abigail, John Quincy's mother, was totally behind this venture. Here is David McCullough's description of the mindset behind this way of parenting. The boy would be away from his mother and his home for most of the next 7 years. McCullough describes what this meant. The boy was being taken across the North Atlantic in the midst of winter, in the midst of war. Just outside Boston Harbor, British ships were waiting to capture somebody like John Adams and take him to London, where most likely he would be hanged as a traitor. But the boy went too, his mother knowing that she probably wouldn't see him for a year or maybe never. Why? Because she and his father wanted John Quincy to be in association with Franklin and the great political philosophers of France, to learn to speak French, to travel in Europe, to be able to soak it all up. And they risked his life for that, for his education. It was a horrendous voyage. Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. And when the boy came back, he said he didn't ever want to go across the Atlantic again as long as he lived. And then his father was called back, and his mother said, "You're going back." And here is what she wrote to him. And keep this in mind. This is being written to an 11-year-old boy. And listen to how different it is from how we talk to our children in our time. It's as if she were addressing a grown-up. She's talking to someone they want to bring along quickly because there's work to do and survival is essential. She says this in a letter to her son. These are the times in which a genius would wish to live. It is not in the still calm of life or the repose of a Pacific station that great characters are formed. The habits of a vigorous mind are formed in contending with difficulties, Great necessities call out great virtues. When a mind is raised and animated by scenes that engage the heart, then those qualities which would otherwise lay dormant wake into life and form the character of the hero and the statesman. Well, of course he went, and the history of our country is different because of it. John Quincy Adams, in my view, was the most superbly educated and maybe the most brilliant human being who ever occupied the executive office. They risked his life for that, for his education, to be with Franklin, to be with the French philosophers, to be at the heart of the great doings of the day, because in their mind, that is what life is for. A life not given to great things is not worth living. So risk your life and the life of your children to be part of greatness. That is powerful, is it not? Now, when I talk about a safety idol, I want to talk about what I am not talking about, okay? I'm not talking about common sense safety. Of course, we want our kids to be safe. We want to keep them from intentionally harming themselves, from running out into the street, from running into danger for danger itself. That's wisdom, keeping them safe in that way. But what does being safety obsessed say about my heart? What does it say about your heart? What does it say about our hearts collectively? I think we can find the answers to this in somewhere a little unusual that you may have not thought of looking. Of course, you'll think of looking in the Bible, but this particular passage that I'm going to share with you today, you may have not thought about it in terms of exposing the core of our safety idols, but I think we can find it if we look together. So I'm going to have you turn to Matthew 25, and I'm going to read verses 14 through 30. It's from a familiar passage called the Parable of the Talents. Many of you have probably heard this. Here we go. For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted them to his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled the accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more. Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I have 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, have what is yours. But the master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has will be given. And he who, let me say that again. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness, in that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, I know a lot of us have heard of this parable in regards to money or stewardship of the gifts that we've been given. And that's right. That's exactly what it's talking about. But something stood out to me when I thought of safety idols and the root of what causes us to be safety obsessed in our culture. And I think we can see it if we look together. I want you to look back at verse 25. I'm going to start in 24, but there's something in verse 25 that I think will be astounding to you. 24 says this, He also who had received the 1 talent, came forward saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. Verse 25, he says this. So I was afraid. So I was afraid. Did you catch that? Fear is at the root of our safety idol. It's fear. But why do we fear? Well, I think we fear because we don't trust God. We fear because just like Eve in the Garden of Eden, we think we can take something in their own hands, we can control it, and we can do a better job of working things out than God can, especially when it comes to our most prized possessions, our children. Speaking of children, I'm reading a book with my son, Ezra, and it's the Chronicles of Narnia. And so we're reading The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. And if you're not familiar with this story, it's a C.S. Lewis story, and it's about this magical kingdom named Narnia. These 3 kids, siblings, actually it's 4 siblings, enter into this kingdom together. And they end up being led around by all these talking animals. And they're running away from the White Witch, who is the evil queen, wants to be queen in the story. And they're running to someone who they say could save him. And his name is Aslan, and he is a lion. And so all the animals, his personification, all the animals speak and talk. And so at this point in the story, the kids have not yet met Aslan, but they're on the way to meet him, and they're nervous. And so they're asking this little family of beavers, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, to explain to them, who is this Aslan, and what should we think about him? Okay. And Mrs. Beaver says this to Lucy, who's the youngest of the 4 siblings. She says this, if there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly. Then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He is the king, I tell you. You guys, he is good, and we must start by believing that he is good. That is where we start to conquer fear, by believing that God is good. And how do we do that? The answer is simple. We love. We love. 1 John 4:18 says this, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. And we know that God is love. So how do we actually practice this? How do we practice love to combat fear? Because most of us would say, well, I already love my kids. I really love them. And I believe that's true. I believe I love my kids. I believe you love your kids. But what are some practical ways we can live this out in our lives? Well, first of all, we have to understand who God is. We have to fall in love with his word and let him speak to us through it and speak to us through his spirit. We're studying about becoming a wholehearted disciple in our church. And so, we know that our thoughts inform our emotions, which inform our desires, which inform our actions. And so when we inform our thoughts who God is, that begins to change the rest of us as well. That begins to change our emotions and our desires and then our actions. Second, we have to believe how much he loves us. Friend, he loves you so much. If I could just reach through the screen right now and squeeze you and hug you and tell you how much God loves you, I would. And for those of you who are not sure what I'm talking about, let me just briefly tell you that he does. He loves you so much that he sent his only son to live a perfect life and to die in your place, because you and I can never get it right, no matter how hard we try. And because of that, we can not only live with him forever in heaven, for eternity, but we can have an abundant life here because he left his spirit to live in us. And if you've never experienced that love, there's a simple way you can do that. There's a verse in the Bible, it's Romans 10:9-10, and it tells us that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And you can do that right here and right now. So I want you to take a second if you're in that place and you're like, I know about God, but I've never experienced his love. I've never received his love in my heart. I invite you to confess with your mouth right now that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead. You confess, God, you are Lord. I believe. I know I can't do it without you. I can't hit the mark. I trust you. I want to follow you. And you are saved. You are with him. You are what we call in Christ. And if you've done that, I'd love for you to share with somebody who's close to you in your life, who's also taken that what we call step of faith, because it is a faith step. We can't see it. It's a faith step. I'd love for you to share with someone or share with me. I'd love to help you on that next step of your journey. So we understand who God is. We believe how much he loves us. And lastly, we live out love. We let our choices be based on love and not fear. We speak out our faith, not our fears. We develop a culture of bravery and courage in our homes. Hebrews 10:39 says, "But we do not belong to those who are shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved." You know, one of the things that I like to do with my kids is I like to share different books with them in our homes. And we read this series of books. It's Christian Heroes Then and Now. This one happens to be, I grabbed this one. This was the C.S. Lewis one since I shared with you a quote from C.S. Lewis. But it's by Janet and Jeff Benge. And Benge is the last name. But it's just a series of books. Adoniram Judson, Gladys Aylward, I can't tell you how many of these we've read. We've read tons and tons of these. And it's just about Christian heroes doing hard things, being brave and courageous, and not shrinking back, not being afraid. And so we learn to speak the language of courage and bravery in our home, not just the language of safety and fear. And when that happens, our thoughts, our desires, our emotions, and our actions are all congruent. We can use love to cast out fear. Well, my fear came to revisit me this past fall on Labor Day. My family and I went to Rock Island State Park to hike and maybe do a little swimming. We had driven out there. We had a picnic lunch. We left our swimsuits in the car and we were going to go hike and just see, where the trails took us. And we came upon this cliff, and it was a rock that was kind of dropped off into a swimming pool, about a 30-foot drop. And immediately my third son, Abe, who is afraid of heights, says, "I'm going to jump off that cliff into the water." And as a mom, I didn't go to fear. I went to real practical. I thought, wait a minute, you don't have your swimsuit. We're 30 minutes away from the car. You're not going to jump off that because I know you're going to be complaining the whole way home that you have wet shorts and wet pants and all that. So I immediately went to the practical part. But then I realized, okay, he's serious about this. And I was like, oh, I'm not going to be jumping off in my shorts, because I'm not driving home in 2 or 3 hours in a wet shorts. I'm not going to do that at all. I know how that is. And so my husband was like, "Do you really want to do this?" And he was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Okay, we're going to do it." I love that about my husband. He's brave. And so they go up to the edge of the cliff, and we had seen some college guys do it right before we had done it. And so we're watching them, and then we walk up there, and my husband gives me his phone, his keys, all the things that he couldn't jump in the water, his shoes, they take their shoes off. And I'm filming, and then my oldest son comes and says, "I want to be a part too." And so it's exciting. Everybody's, you're anxious, but it's an excited kind of nervous. And I've got the camera up, my husband's camera, and I'm filming it with his phone. And they're 1, 2, 3, and they jump, except for my oldest son was a little afraid, so he stayed back. And so he jumped, my son Abe and my husband jump. And then they hit the water, and we're screaming, "Good job, way to go, guys." And then Oak sees, okay, Oak is my oldest. He says, "Oh, this is going to be fine." So he jumps in after them. Well, I'm watching Oak. As I'm watching Oak jump in, I hear my husband yell, "Swim, Abe, swim." And I realize immediately that something's wrong. And so I look over to the side where they should be making their way to the edge where they can climb up. And I see that my husband, Carl, has made his way there, but he's looking back. And my son, Abe, is swimming in one direction. But there's an undercurrent that we didn't see that was pulling him in another direction. So he's swimming in this direction and is being pulled in a different direction. And I immediately go to fear and really terror. My husband jumps back into the water to swim to Abe. At this point, Abe has started going under because he's so frantic. He realizes he can't swim to the edge, and he's getting nervous. He's making himself kind of freak out. And so he goes under. Well, my husband goes under and tries to push him back to the edge. But all that does is that propels my husband further away from him in the opposite direction and pulls him away by the stream and the current of this river. And at this point, my husband's too far away to get back to him, and he's being swept away. My son Abe is there by himself. My son Oak has made it to the edge, and then my other two sons are on the edge watching, and I'm standing here having no clue what to do. And I remember saying the name of Jesus over and over again. I yelled to my son Oak, "Go help your brother." And he jumps in. Oak is a strong swimmer, but it was just something I did. I didn't even think about it, the spur of the moment thing. And he jumped out there. My husband can't swim to help him, and Abe is under at this point, screaming, "Help me," and no one is around to help. I even thought at that point, I'm going to jump off, but then in that same split second, I thought if I jump out to save him and my boys see us, I have two boys on the edge that'll see us both go under, what do we do? So all these thoughts are going on in my mind. My son Oak swims out and convinces Abe to float because he can float. And if he doesn't fight the current and he floats, eventually, because there are not rapids there, it'll eventually spit them out somewhere where they can crawl out. And that's what happened, thankfully. Thank the Lord, that's what happened in that scenario. Only when they were spit out on the other side of the river. And there's not a good place to cross. You just can't cross it. The current is too strong. So we're separated. And by that point, they don't have shoes and they don't have a phone. So it takes us a couple hours to get back to each other. I'll share you the details of all that. But needless to say, when we finally made it back to each other, it was a tearful and joyful reunion. The 2 nights following that, I had to take some medicine to help me sleep because I had such anxiety about that moment. The nights following, I had trouble falling asleep, and I would periodically throughout the day relive the incident and just be gripped with the fear. I would break out into a cold sweat. It was visceral, and I would relive the incident over and over again in my mind. However, as I continued to talk to God about my feelings and fears surrounding the event, He, in His ever so kind and gentle way, reminded me of how much He is for Abe. He reminded me also that He is using all of this to write a greater story, and He wants to use Abe in it. And guess what? He wants to use your kids in His greater story as well. It's a story of love and of faith, not safety and fear. He wants to write that story for your children. He wants to write that story for you. A story where you focus not on what ifs, but what is. A story where He is the hero and we're not. Where fear is thwarted, safety is secondary, and love wins. Will you let Him write that story for you and your family?